Your book review, Consciousness and the Brain, finalist number 1 of the book review contest. Imagine that there was a generally acknowledged test for artificial intelligence to find out whether a computer program is truly intelligent. And imagine that a computer program passed this test for the first time. How would you feel about it? The most likely answer is disappointed. We know this because it happened several times. The first time was in 1966, when Eliza passed the Turing test. Eliza was a chatbot who could fool some people to believe that they talked with a real human. Before Eliza, people assumed that only an intelligent machine could do that, but it just turned out that it's really easy to fool others. Other tests for intelligence were playing chess, playing a whole variety of games, or recognizing cat images. Machines can do all of this by now, and this is awesome, and yet every success sparked new disappointment because we didn't find any magic ingredient, some quality that will make a difference between intelligent and non-intelligent. When the groundbreaking GPT-3 and DALL-E suddenly could write news articles or poetry, we could dream up snails made of harp. The main improvement was that they used more raw computation power than the previous versions. If you find this disappointing, then you will also be disappointed by Consciousness and the Brain by Stanislaw Dehaene. The book is the condensed wisdom of 3 decades of cognitive research, and it tells you what consciousness is, how it operates, and why we have it. The book actually answers these questions. But if you were hoping that the book would resolve philosophy, tell you what makes humankind unique, or whether free will exists, it doesn't do that. It only tells you what consciousness is. Consciousness. What is it not? In order to study consciousness, we first need to recognize it. Dehaene's approach to this is simple and bold. A perception or a thought is conscious if you can report on it. If a test subject sees the word range on a screen and you ask her to report what word she has seen, then the answer might be 1. I have seen the word range, or 2. What word? There was no word. In the first case, she has seen the word consciously, in the second, not. This approach is more radical than it seems. Researchers are very cautious to take introspection at face value, and rightfully so, since our introspection is often wrong. The beauty of Dehaene's approach is that he only extracts a single bit of information, yes or no. It turns out that there are experiments which differ only in a minimal aspect, e.g. a slightly longer or shorter time delay, and which trigger either 1 or 2 reliably across many trials and many test subjects. I'll describe a few such setups later, but the point is that you can trust the reports because different people consistently give the same answer in the same situation. It's important to understand that Dehaene's book is only about this definition of consciousness. It is not about cognition in the sense of abstract reasoning, or metacognition, the ability to reflect about your own thoughts. It's not about self-consciousness, being aware of oneself. And of course, there are other definitions of consciousness. The most compelling alternative calls Dehaene's concept conscious access, and distinguishes it from conscious perception. But for this review, I will stick with Dehaene's definition. Another different, though related concept is attention. For Dehaene, attention is the gating mechanism that decides which information is allowed to enter consciousness. But this process itself is unconscious. We're not aware of all the options that were considered and discarded, only of the winner. This notion of attention is broadly in line with the mainstream of the field, though the exact definition varies. Controlling consciousness. To understand consciousness, the first step is to understand how unconscious processing works. Some glimpses come from blind sight patients who lose the ability to see consciously due to brain damage. This can affect their whole field of vision, or just one hemisphere, or even just specific forms like lines. But they remain able to unconsciously process what they see. They will automatically walk around objects in their way, even though they swear that they don't see them. The effect can also be artificially produced in monkeys. Fortunately, there are also ways to make perception unconscious in ordinary people. You don't always perceive images consciously if they are presented with a low contrast or for a short time. Similarly, binocular rivalry occurs if your two eyes are presented with different images. In this case, most of the time you don't see a weird overlay of the two images, but instead your conscious perception flips between seeing either one or the other. It's a bit like staring at an ambiguous images, but more consistent. So at any point in time you perceive one of the images consciously and the other unconsciously. Another item is attentional blinking, which describes the effect that after a conscious perception, you are consciously blind for anything that you see in the next 200 to 300 milliseconds. Let's say you watch a fast stream of digits, each only visible for 100 milliseconds, and occasionally the stream contains a letter instead of a number. You're supposed to detect the letters. When you see an M, this enters your consciousness and you detect it. But if 300 milliseconds, 3 images later, there's another S, you will not see it consciously. Actually, you will be sure that there was no S in the stream. And another item, with transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, we can stimulate specific brain regions. By stimulating sensory areas, we can induce hallucinations, and we can either make them conscious or unconscious by regulating the strength of TMS. By interfering with the right region at the right time, we can also prevent real perceptions from entering consciousness. End of the list. All these setups are useful, but they're not 100% reliable, more like 80% at best. For example, binocular rivalry is different in autistic people. But there's one setup which works always for everyone, and that is masking. In masking, you see some shapes, the mask, then very briefly an image, and then the shapes again. If the image is shown for 30 milliseconds, then people do not consciously see it, while for 60 milliseconds they do. This works with almost 100% accuracy and has become the main workhorse for consciousness studies. You can even mask only a part of the screen if you want. While subjects are presented with masked words, numbers, and images, the researchers can measure the brain activity with EEG, MEG, fMRI, or even implanted electrodes for epileptic patients who have the electrodes for unrelated medical reasons. They measure how the skin starts to sweat and the body tenses up from the unconscious perception, and most easily they measure how it affects the performance in a subsequent conscious task. For example, seeing the word bank unconsciously will make you react faster to a related word like money, an effect known as priming. Should I believe this? Wait a moment, priming? Aren't those the wrong conclusions that were wiped out by the big replication crisis in psychology? Should I really believe these things? I think yes. It's hard to convey in a review how painstakingly pedantic the field apparently is. There are a lot of different opinions on consciousness, and the experiments are scrupulously examined for any possible flaw or alternative interpretation, both from insiders and outsiders of the field. Just to give one example, in the priming study with bank and money, the conclusion was that the words are processed semantically, not just as a bunch of characters. Dehane mentions not one paper getting this result, but 4. Then he describes how critics were not satisfied and gives 5 more papers which address the critics. But for reasons going deep into the precise setups, it was still not settled whether this actually proves the claim that the meaning is processed, which made the original authors re-examine their results and publish a follow-up paper providing that, indeed, the critics were right and their setup was no proof, which triggered an avalanche of follow-up work until it was waterproof beyond doubt. Dehane cites 44 papers just on this debate, and there was never any doubt whether the raw results were reproducible. The debate was about whether the experiments left room for alternative interpretations. I wish my own fields of research would be just half as rigorous as what I read in this book. I've read one other scientific book which breathes the same positive pedantry, and that is Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? By Frans de Waal. I think there's a pattern. It helps that both fields treat a topic on which everyone has their own opinion, so they get a lot of know-alls from outside the field interfering with the discussion. But more importantly, they're based on methods which used to be tabooed inside their scientific community. Duval treated his animals as personalities and even bonded with them instead of keeping neutral distance, and he took wildlife observations seriously. All of this was considered totally unscientific, so he was forced to be extra scrupulous in his experiments. For Dehane and his colleagues, it was the paradigm that subjective reports can and should be believed, as a source of raw data without making the mistake of conflating the subjective belief with reality. When patients tell you after surgery that they had the impression to leave their body and float at the ceiling, then you should not believe that they actually floated. You should believe that floating was their true feeling, and that probably there's a neuroscientific cause for this feeling. Taking it seriously eventually enabled researchers to induce the feeling of leaving your body in any person by using the right neural stimulation. But until the 90s, it was scientifically taboo to take subjective feelings into account, so experiments with low standards would have been torn apart. I find these examples encouraging because they show that even strong taboos can be overcome if your science is just good enough. Not surprisingly, the replication crisis hit cognitive psychology much less hard than other fields like social sciences. Of 9 key findings of cognitive psychology, all 9 could be reproduced, including 3 that are core to the book. Yes, a lot of priming experiments were not replicable, and only a hardcore survived, but this book is about that hardcore. Of course, some of the 1300 papers cited by Dehane will be wrong, but I have a lot of trust in the general picture. What we can do without consciousness. Okay, let us believe that the results on unconscious processes are real. What can the brain do with unconscious information? A lot. The experiments fill a big chunk of the book, and I can't go into detail. I've already mentioned that your unconscious brain does not just process the letters of a word, it also deciphers the meaning. For example, a masked 4 primes you not just for recognizing the word 4, but also for the number 4 spelled in capital letters, a spoken 4, and even for the number 3. In fact, it primes you better for 3 than for 2. The priming is stronger the closer the numbers are. Unconscious perception can induce negative emotions, and you can unconsciously distinguish faces in abstract categories like object and animal. You can unconsciously estimate averages. Unconscious perceptions can control your attention. An unconscious stop signal will activate your executive control center in the brain. Sometimes this prevents you from pressing a button that you were supposed to press, which seems like a mysterious mistake to you. You can also unconsciously detect errors. When you make a mistake in an eye tracking task, your error control system will flash even if the signal never reaches your consciousness, in which case you don't notice that you have made a mistake. You can even learn new things unconsciously. If you get a reward after each unconscious presentation, and you get more reward after image A than after image B, then you learn that A is worth more, even if you never consciously see any images at all. For you, it seems like you look at a screen where nothing interesting happens and you get completely random rewards. What we cannot do without consciousness. So if we can do so many things unconsciously, what do we even need consciousness for? What is the effect of a conscious perception? Traces of unconscious perception are spurious. They're almost completely gone after a second. It means that tasks which require working memory cannot be performed unconsciously. For example, in order to compute 12 times 13, we need to perform several subsequent steps and use the intermediate result of one step as an input for the next one. This task cannot be performed unconsciously. It seems that the unconscious traces are too weak to be used as an input for a second step. Dehane tries to pinpoint the exact point of complexity that can be performed unconsciously, and it seems to be very low. After seeing a number n unconsciously, test persons are well above chance for the task of naming n. But I haven't seen anything. Well, don't worry, just take a random guess. Naming n plus 2 or deciding whether n is lower than 5. But deciding whether n plus 2 is smaller than 5 is already at chance level. Dehane suspects that complex language, like conversation with others, also falls into this category of processes that require working memory. It's not mentioned in the book, but the same probably holds for trains of thought, including cognition. Consciousness has a coordination effect. Imagine you see some line moving in a diagonal direction over the screen. We know very well what happens in the low-level visual areas. The neurons there cannot see the whole picture. They have only a limited perceptive field. For them, the image is ambiguous. It is impossible to decide from their local information whether the line moves upwards or to the right or diagonally. Some neurons will decide for upwards and encode that, others will decide for right or for diagonally. If the image remains unconscious, then these mismatches are never resolved. However, if the image enters consciousness, then after 120 to 140 milliseconds, all neurons in the lower layers suddenly start to encode diagonally. Now they agree on the same interpretation of the world. De Haan phrases this in a way that ACX readers will love. For him, the unconscious or preconscious neural activity encodes a probability distribution over the possible states of the world. If we see the word bank, then the meaning credit institute and sitting bench are both represented by some neurons, so they both occur in this probability distribution. When the word reaches consciousness, then the brain samples from this distribution, so it decides for one of the possible options, and all neurons are overwritten for this meaning. For example, in binocular rivalry, when your two eyes see incompatible images, you will sometimes see option A, sometimes option B, but usually not both. Once you have drawn a sample, this is not a final decision. In binocular rivalry, your perception switches every few seconds between A and B. Some researchers even claim that the brain gets the Bayesian math right. If you present an image that is ambiguous in a very clever way, such that there is an objective underlying probability of 70% for A and 30% for B, then you will see A for 70% of the time and B for 30% of the time. Others claim that you can play Wisdom of the Crowd in single-player modus. Say you want to know the weight of a cow, then take a guess. Now throw your guess out of the window and take another guess. Finally, compute the average of your two guesses. The claim is that this average is better than your individual guesses. Such sampling has obvious benefits. If I have to walk around a tree, then choosing either left or right is fine, but my whole brain and body should stick to this decision. So conscious sampling is very important for decision making, but it goes beyond that. The way how we perceive the world in a conscious moment is already a selection, as the rotating mask illusion nicely illustrates. There's another interesting effect of consciousness that De Haan only mentions casually a few times. It enables us to gauge our confidence, so test subjects can say, "I am certain," or "this was just a guess." We can test these self-assessments with betting systems, and we're good at this, but only if the task was based on conscious perception. If it's based on unconscious perception, then we may still be good at the task itself, but our self-assessment is inaccurate. Often we underestimate our performance. By the way, simple betting systems, consisting essentially of the options yes, no, and not sure, also show that mice, monkeys, and dolphins know how confident they are. We'll have to wait a bit for results on how consciousness affects self-assessment in animals, but researchers have speculated that the results should be similar, suggesting that a prediction market of unconscious mice may work poorly. Consciousness and learning. In this section, I will go a bit beyond the book, so this might be a bit less reliable than the rest. I've worked on research of neuroplasticity and learning, so the ideas do not come entirely out of thin air. To understand the effect of consciousness on learning, you should first know that there are two different types of long-term memory, procedural and episodic memory. Procedural memory allows us to walk, ride a bike, or play the piano. For this review, I will pull it together with semantic memory, the knowledge that birds can fly, or things that you have learned by heart, like a song or the multiplication table. We can use procedural memory in automatic mode, and we can acquire and access it unconsciously. Acquiring procedural memory often requires a lot of practice and repetition. This type of learning is usually slow and decentral in the brain. Only the regions which are directly relevant to the task are involved in this type of learning. It shares many similarities with modern machine learning systems. On the other hand, episodic memory refers to specific moments of your life, for example, remembering what you had for breakfast or what your conversation partner said 5 minutes ago. This memory is one shot, so the memory is instantaneously formed and does not require any repetition. Aspects of episodic memory can be transferred into procedural memory. When you learn the name of your new colleague, then this stays in episodic memory for a while, but it becomes procedural semantic memory after a few repetitions. Sometimes we don't even need repetition, for example when we recognize a face after a single meeting, or when a child acquires new words. But this relies on complicated interaction between the two types of memory that I won't get into here. Usually, we can make a clear distinction. It seems that episodic memory without consciousness is plainly impossible, and I will come back to that. But consciousness also helps for procedural memory, even though it can be formed from purely unconscious perceptions. First, think of consciousness as giving a boost to the learning rate. I've mentioned before that episodic memory, which requires consciousness, can be transferred into procedural memory during sleep, and this is stronger than the effect of the direct experience alone. You will still not be able to learn the piano in a week, but consciousness probably makes learning faster. Second, as Dehaene explains in his book, you only connect unconscious events with each other if they are simultaneous. This makes sense because unconscious neural activity fades away so quickly. Dehaene describes some classical conditioning experiments similar to Pavlov's dog, where the sound of a bell is associated with receiving food. But if, to stay in the picture, the bell is perceived unconsciously, then the connection is only made if the bell rings while the reward comes, plus or minus at most 1 second, not if the bell rings a few seconds earlier. For episodic memory, I think that it's even more closely entangled with consciousness. I believe that the coherent activity of consciousness is exactly the form of neural patterns that can be stored in episodic memory. Thus, a conscious perception creates a memory item that can be stored and retrieved later. Let me explain why. A crucial property of memory is pattern completion, that you can retrieve the whole memory pattern from activation of a small part. So the word croissant may trigger the image of a croissant, the smell of it, the taste, the texture, and so on. But the same works vice versa. The smell of a croissant also triggers the rest. There is no core of the concept croissant that needs to be present in order to trigger the whole concept. For procedural memory, this is not a big deal. Since this memory is formed slowly, there is enough time to nicely embed it into existing structures. But episodic memory is one-shot learning. It needs to be formed in a second. There is some long-term consolidation later during sleeping, but this only shifts the problem. The brain still needs to maintain traces of the pattern for 16 hours. And it's really hard to embed a complex concept so deep into an existing network that you still have pattern completion. Mind that every change in the brain needs to be cautious because you have a lot of systems that should still be working after the change. In machine learning, in case of doubt, you set your learning rates really low, and that is for the same reason. You don't want to override all the existing functions of your network, and the task is more difficult for more complex patterns. If each neuron represented its own interpretation of reality, then it would be pretty hopeless to encode all this into a retrievable pattern in just 1 second. But it gets a lot easier if the activity of all neurons throughout your whole brain are highly consistent with each other, and that is precisely what consciousness seems to achieve. This is why I believe that consciousness might create the items that we can store in our episodic memory. Properties of consciousness. For an unconscious perception, the main brain activity is in perceptual regions, visual regions for images, auditory regions for sound, and so on. The signal can travel further into the brain, but only reaches a few regions and gets weaker and weaker. A conscious perception does not get weaker, it gets stronger as it travels. Dehaene compares unconscious perception with a wave that runs out at the shore, while a conscious perception is like an avalanche that gains momentum. After 400 milliseconds, the conscious avalanche has activated large parts of the brain, which Dehaene calls global ignition. Moreover, all the brain parts synchronize and information flows from all parts into each other. This is not a metaphor. Flow of information is a well-defined quantity measured by so-called Granger causality. Granger causality is a useful concept with a terrible name since it's about a complex form of correlation and not about causality. Whatever it is, it suggests strongly, without being a proof, that all parts of the brain talk intensively with each other. Dehaene goes into a lot of details on the exact form of these signals in exchange, but I will cut it short. It all fits very well with the assumption that in a conscious moment the brain creates a coherent worldview which we call sampling, coordination, or creating a memory item. Dehaene compares it with a memo that the CIA prepares for the president. It does not contain all the details of hundreds of sub-reports, but it's a highly condensed summary of the worldview of the CIA. This metaphor expresses nicely how the information is compressed, but mind that it leaves out two aspects. In a conscious moment, information also flows downward to the low-level areas, and they change their activation patterns to make them compatible. So it's as if all CIA members would read the presidential memo and start to rewrite their own local reports to match this worldview. I hope that the CIA doesn't actually work this way. Second, in the brain there's no single president to make decisions. There are regions that we call executive control regions, but they're notoriously hard to pinpoint, and there's no region which is always involved in decisions. It might be more accurate to think of a committee meeting of all brain regions who discuss and decide on a topic. Consciousness has a severe disadvantage. It is really slow. A conscious perception takes about half a second, 500 milliseconds. This is ages compared to neural transmission speed. If you're shown two images and you're supposed to pick out the one with the animal, then your eyes start moving to the correct image after 70 to 100 milliseconds. Not with 100% accuracy, but far above chance. In a 100-meter sprint, you really don't want to wait for 500 milliseconds before you start running. Or imagine playing computer games with 2 frames per second, which is not funny. So a lot of our everyday life runs on autopilot. This is also the reason why predictions are so important for the brain. Some cool experiments show that when we're shown a surprising image, the time we believe the image to appear is 300 milliseconds after it actually appears. But if we can predict the image, there's no such delay and we perceive the timing correctly. Consciousness is also exclusive. While a conscious perception is processed, which may consist of several components like an image and a compatible sound, the activity blocks off other perceptions. They're either missed completely or can only be processed after the 500 milliseconds are over. There's something like a buffer in which a perception can be stored until consciousness is ready again, but it will not be processed before that. Again, there are cool time perception experiments which show that quite convincingly. So our consciousness runs at most at 2 perceptions per second, and other than unconscious operations, it cannot be parallelized. Insights into the inside. Now that we understand consciousness, we have quite a lot of tests to tell apart conscious from unconscious processing. Indirect clues come from abilities. It seems that working memory requires consciousness, and Dehaene has developed some very detailed tests to decide whether someone is conscious. Not just for fun. He works with patients in long-time coma, more precisely in vegetative state, and some of them are fully conscious locked-in patients, but this is quite hard to detect. Dehaene has developed tools for detecting traces of consciousness in such patients, and they can predict to some extent whether the patients will eventually recover. They're also useful for developing communication devices for locked-in patients. But we can also apply the tests to healthy individuals and see what we get. We're not conscious during anesthesia, what a surprise, but sleeping is already more complicated. Most sleep phases are unconscious. In dream phases, REM sleep, external stimulation usually does not spark consciousness. However, the brain does react like a conscious brain if the stimulus is indirectly implanted into the brain via magnetic stimulation, TMS. So perhaps we are conscious in dreams and we're only cut off from outside perception. But it is too early to be certain. Also, although the book does not discuss this point, I wonder whether we're conscious all of our daytime. Probably we don't use the full bandwidth of 2 conscious perceptions per second the whole day. How conscious are we when we enter the flow during a marathon? Can meditation suppress consciousness? I don't know. A part that really made me think is Dehaene's theory of schizophrenia. I've heard a lot of explanations for schizophrenia, and most of them sound superficially compelling, but collapse pretty quickly when you dig into them. This one has not collapsed yet, at least not for me. Dehaene believes that schizophrenia is what you get if you partially lose conscious perceptions. This sounds ridiculous at first, but as always, Dehaene makes it really hard to shrug this off as obvious nonsense. He claims that in order to reach consciousness, a masked signal needs to last much longer for schizophrenic patients. I expected that much longer means whatever passes your p-value test, but I looked into the study. It was 90 milliseconds versus 59 milliseconds. That's a lot. The maximum of the control group, N is 28, was roughly the same as the average of the schizophrenic group, which was also N is 28. And of course it doesn't stop there. Also for other effects of consciousness, schizophrenics really stick out. That link is worth clicking. Dehaene describes how the other neural signatures of consciousness are disturbed or even plainly missing. He describes how schizophrenia can be caused by certain neuroanatomic damage, in terms of regions and neuron types, which happen to be exactly the type of damage that would impair consciousness. He tells compelling stories on how consciousness would explain the positive and the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. He mentions some weird autoimmune disease which gives you super strong schizophrenic effects, from hallucinations to paranoia, until you spontaneously lose your consciousness after 3 weeks and possibly never regain it. I'm still cautious about the story, simply because I have a really low prior that we ever find a theory of schizophrenia, But if you hope for such a theory, you should know this candidate. Conclusion. So consciousness has upsides and downsides. It's really slow, it's exclusive, and it simplifies the world into a highly compressed sample. This can be useful in its own right, for example, to make a decision. A lot of information is lost in this process, but apparently the resulting pattern is so simple that it can be processed further. Since all parts of the brain participate in a conscious event, it's also universally available in the brain. Dehane calls this function the global neuronal workspace. Propagating something to consciousness is similar to loading something into a register of a computer so that it can be processed further. I believe that consciousness is even more. It creates the item in the first place. The item can then be stored and retrieved, and it can be used as input for mental algorithms. Of course, a conscious thought does not need to be triggered from the outside. It can also be the next step of a mental algorithm, like the next thought in a train of thoughts, and it can come, fully or partially, from episodic memory or mental associations. Dehane adds that due to its simplicity, these memory items can often be expressed in language, and thus they can be transmitted to others. Thus consciousness is probably a necessary factor for the complex language and culture of humans. Necessary, but not sufficient. Many animals around us are conscious too. Humans are special in many ways, but being conscious is not among them. After this long review, does it still make sense to read the book? Yes, absolutely. It describes tons of really fascinating experiments that I had to skip, and is really pleasant to read. As are other books by Dehane, especially Reading in the Brain and The Number Sense, which discuss how the brain processes text and numbers. Now there's an Appendix A and an Appendix B to this text, but I won't be reading that out. Thank you.